Daily life in Viking Age Scandinavia followed patterns shaped by harsh climate and maritime culture. The period from approximately 800 to 1100 CE saw Norse peoples living in settlements scattered throughout modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, with some establishing communities in Iceland, Greenland, and other distant locations. Most Vikings lived as farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople, whose existence centered on their local communities, though the period is also known for the raids and explorations that took some Norse people far from their homelands. The routines of daily life reflected both the practical demands of surviving in a challenging northern environment and the social structures that organized Viking society into households, communities, and larger political units. The physical environment of Scandinavia presented both opportunities and challenges for human settlement. The landscape featured fjords cutting deep into rocky coasts, forests of pine and birch covering much of the land, mountains rising in the interior, and relatively small areas of arable land suitable for agriculture. The climate brought long, dark winters with snow and ice, and brief summers when the extended daylight hours allowed intensive agricultural work and other outdoor activities. The sea provided access to fish and marine mammals that supplemented agricultural production, while also serving as highways for travel and trade. The air carried the scent of pine forests, salt from the sea, and the smoke of countless fires used for heating and cooking. Houses in Viking settlements reflected both the climate and available materials, with most dwellings constructed using a combination of wood and turf. The typical longhouse consisted of a rectangular structure with walls made from vertical wooden posts supporting horizontal timbers, the spaces between filled with wattle and daub or stacked turf. The roof was covered with layers of birch bark and turf, creating thick insulation that helped retain heat during the long winters. The entire structure sat on a stone foundation that raised it slightly above ground level, providing some protection from moisture. The longhouse ranged in size depending on the family's wealth and status, from modest structures housing a single family to large buildings that accommodated extended families, servants, and slaves. The interior of a Viking longhouse consisted of a single long room, with a central hearth providing heat and light, while also serving as the cooking area. Smoke from this fire rose toward the roof and escaped through gaps in the thatch or through a hole left specifically for this purpose, though much smoke remained inside, gradually blackening the ceiling and filling the upper part of the space with a permanent haze. Platforms along the sides of the longhouse served multiple purposes, providing seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. These platforms were covered with furs, woven blankets, and cushions stuffed with feathers or wool, creating relatively comfortable spaces despite the basic conditions. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that provided some insulation and could be replaced when soiled. The furnishings in Viking homes remained minimal, with most items serving multiple practical purposes. Wooden chests stored clothing, valuables, and other possessions, while also serving as seats or tables when needed. Benches provided seating along the walls, while simple wooden tables could be set up for meals and removed afterward to create more space.
Cooking equipment included iron pots and cauldrons that hung over the fire, wooden bowls and plates, and various tools for food preparation. Wealthier households owned more elaborate items, including decorated chests, bronze or silver vessels, and imported goods that displayed the family's status and connections to trade networks.
The daily routine in Viking settlements began early, particularly during summer when the long daylight hours made extended work possible. People rose from their sleeping arrangements and began the day's activities, with women tending the fire and preparing the morning meal, while men checked on livestock or prepared for whatever work the day required. The morning air in different seasons brought varied sensations, from the bitter cold of winter mornings when breath condensed in clouds, to the fresh coolness of summer mornings when the sun rose early and stayed late. The sounds of morning included the calls of seabirds along the coast, the lowing of cattle, the voices of people beginning their work, and the crackle of fires being stoked. Breakfast in Viking households consisted of simple, filling food designed to provide energy for physical labor. Porridge made from barley or oats represented a common morning meal, perhaps accompanied by bread, cheese, or dried fish. The bread was typically flat and dense, made from barley or rye flour, and baked on flat stones near the fire or in simple ovens. Milk from cows, goats, or sheep provided fresh drink or could be made into butter and cheese through processes that occupied considerable time and effort. The consumption of food occurred without elaborate ceremony, with family members eating from wooden bowls using wooden spoons or simply eating with their hands. Agriculture formed the foundation of Viking economy, despite the limited areas suitable for cultivation in the rocky Scandinavian landscape. Farmers grew barley, oats, and rye as their primary grain crops, along with vegetables including cabbages, onions, and beans. The agricultural year followed a compressed cycle, with planting occurring as soon as the ground thawed in spring and harvesting taking place in late summer before the onset of autumn cold. The work of farming required intensive labor during the brief growing season, with entire families participating in plowing, planting, weeding, and harvesting. The sound of iron-tipped wooden plows breaking through soil, the calls of farmers directing their oxen, and the voices of workers moving through fields created the acoustic landscape of the agricultural season. Animal husbandry represented an equally important element of Viking economy, with most households keeping cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. These animals provided milk, meat, hides, wool, and other products essential for survival. The care of livestock required constant attention, with animals needing to be fed, watered, milked, and protected from predators. During winter, animals were brought into barns or shelters attached to the main dwelling, their body heat providing additional warmth, while also requiring daily work to clean stalls and provide fodder. The smell of animals and their waste formed a constant element of life in Viking settlements, particularly during winter when close quarters concentrated these odors. Fishing and hunting supplemented agricultural production, providing protein and other resources that farming alone could not supply. The seas and rivers of Scandinavia contained abundant fish, including cod, herring, and salmon, while seals and whales provided meat, oil, and other useful products. Fishing occurred throughout the year using nets, hooks, and traps, with some fishing requiring boats, while other methods could be employed from shore. The preservation of fish through drying, salting, or smoking created stores of food that could last through the winter months when fresh supplies were scarce.
The smell of fish being processed and preserved characterized coastal settlements, particularly during seasons when fishing was most productive.
Hunting in the forests provided game including deer, elk, bears, and various smaller animals whose meat, furs, and other parts served multiple purposes. The hunt required skill and knowledge of animal behavior, with hunters using bows, spears, and traps to capture their prey. The successful hunt provided not only food, but also materials for clothing, with fur and leather being processed into garments, bedding, and other items. The work of tanning hides and preparing furs involved processes that created distinctive odors and required considerable time and skill passed down through generations. Craftwork represented important economic activity, with specialized workers producing the various goods needed for daily life. Blacksmiths forged iron tools, weapons, and other metal items, their workshops filled with the sound of hammers striking metal and the smell of charcoal fires and hot iron. Woodworkers carved and shaped timber into boats, buildings, furniture, and countless other items, the sound of axes, saws, and other tools creating background noise in settlements. Women engaged in textile production, processing wool or flax into thread through spinning, and then weaving this thread into cloth on vertical looms. The rhythmic sound of the loom and the steady hum of the spinning wheel represented familiar domestic noises throughout Viking lands. Social hierarchy in Viking society created distinctions between free men who owned land and had legal rights, free men who worked others' land or practiced trades, and enslaved people who lacked legal personhood and performed whatever labor their owners required. The elite, including chieftains and wealthy landowners, controlled significant resources and wielded political power within their communities and regions. These leaders maintained their positions through a combination of inherited status, personal ability, and the distribution of gifts and favors that created networks of obligation and loyalty. The display of wealth through fine clothing, jewelry, elaborate weapons, and generous hospitality demonstrated status while also fulfilling social expectations about how leaders should behave. Women in Viking society occupied complex positions, with some enjoying considerable authority within households and even inheriting property in certain circumstances, though their legal status remained subordinate to men. Women managed households, supervised the work of servants and slaves, and controlled the keys that symbolized their authority over domestic spaces and resources. The production of textiles represented particularly important women's work, with the creation of clothing and other fabric items requiring enormous investments of time and skill. Some women accompanied their husbands on trading voyages or even participated in raids, though this remained exceptional rather than typical behavior. Children in Viking families learned appropriate skills through observation and participation in household and community work from relatively young ages. Boys learned farming, fishing, hunting, and fighting skills from their fathers and other men, while girls learned domestic skills, including textile production, food preparation, and household management from their mothers and other women. Formal education in the sense of literacy and book learning remained limited, as writing using runes served primarily for inscriptions and records rather than literary purposes. Cultural knowledge was transmitted orally through stories, poems, and the observation of rituals and customs that taught proper behavior and preserved historical memory. The afternoon hours in Viking settlements saw continued work, though the specific activities varied by season and individual circumstances. Summer afternoons might find people working in fields, fishing, or engaged in various crafts and maintenance tasks, taking advantage of the extended daylight to accomplish as much as possible before winter returned. Winter afternoons brought different activities, with people remaining indoors engaged in craft production, tool repair, and the countless other tasks that could be performed in the limited light and warmth of the longhouse. Trade connected Viking communities to the wider world, with merchants traveling both by sea and over land to exchange Scandinavian products for goods not available locally. The exports included furs, amber, walrus ivory, and enslaved people captured in raids, while imports brought in silver, wine, fine textiles, glass, and various luxury items. The arrival of traders created occasions for commerce and the exchange of news from distant places, connecting even remote settlements to broader networks of exchange and communication. Markets operated at certain locations and times, with people gathering to buy and sell goods while also participating in social and political activities that accompanied these commercial gatherings. Later in the afternoon, as the day's main work drew toward completion, activities shifted toward preparing for evening. Animals needed to be secured for the night, with doors and gates fastened to protect them from predators. The evening milking of cows provided fresh milk for immediate consumption or processing. Women prepared the main meal of the day, while men finished final tasks and returned to the longhouse. The quality of light changed with the seasons, from the long twilight of summer evenings to the early darkness of winter, when the sun set in mid-afternoon and night lasted for many hours. The main meal of the day occurred in the evening, when families gathered around the hearth to share food and warmth. For most Vikings, this meal consisted of simple but hearty fare, including bread, porridge, fish or meat when available, cheese, and whatever vegetables could be preserved or grown. The food was prepared by boiling, roasting over the fire, or baking, with various methods employed depending on the ingredients and desired results. The meal was eaten while sitting on the benches along the walls, with family members eating from wooden bowls and plates, using knives and spoons to handle food. Ale or mead accompanied meals in households that could produce or afford these beverages, while water or milk served for those with fewer resources. Evening hours after the meal brought opportunities for leisure and social interaction within the constraints of limited artificial lighting. Oil lamps or candles made from animal fat provided some illumination, though their light remained dim, and these items were used sparingly due to the effort required to produce them. Storytelling represented an important form of entertainment and education, with sagas and poems being recited from memory, preserving historical knowledge, cultural values, and entertainment in oral form. These stories often recounted the deeds of gods and heroes, historical events, family genealogies, and moral lessons, their telling creating social bonds while also passing cultural knowledge from one generation to the next.
Music played a role in Viking social life, with various instruments, including lyres, harps, and simple wind instruments being played at gatherings and celebrations. Singing accompanied much music-making, with songs ranging from simple work songs to complex poetic compositions. Dancing occurred at celebrations, particularly at weddings and seasonal festivals that marked transitions in the agricultural year or honored gods. The sound of music and voices created an atmosphere quite different from the quiet of most winter evenings, when darkness and cold limited activities. As night fell over Viking settlements, the darkness became nearly absolute during winter months, when only the aurora borealis provided natural light beyond the stars. The long winter nights meant that people spent many hours inside their homes, maintaining fires for warmth and light while engaging in whatever activities the conditions allowed. Summer brought the opposite extreme, with nights that never became fully dark, the sun setting briefly below the horizon before rising again.
This midnight sun created conditions where work could theoretically continue around the clock, though people still needed rest and the normal daily rhythm continued despite the constant light. Sleeping arrangements consisted of the platforms along the longhouse walls, with family members sleeping under furs and woven blankets that provided warmth against the cold that penetrated even the best insulated buildings. The fire in the central hearth was maintained through the night, someone rising periodically to add fuel and ensure it did not go out completely, as rekindling fire from scratch represented laborious work better avoided. The sounds of night included the breathing and shifting of sleeping family members, the crackle of the fire, the wind outside, and, during winter, the creaking of frozen timbers and the occasional howl of wolves or other animals. The cycle of daily life in Viking Age Scandinavia continued day after day, season after season, creating patterns that structured existence in this challenging northern environment. Individual lives unfolded within the larger contexts of family, community, and the complex social hierarchies that organized Viking society. While the period is famous for the raids and explorations that took some Norse people to distant lands, most Vikings never left their home regions, their lives centered on the fundamental activities of farming, fishing, raising families, and maintaining the household and community bonds that made survival possible in a harsh climate with limited resources. This simple, steady pattern of daily existence in Viking Age Scandinavia was an ordinary reality for the people who called these northern lands their home.
Daily life in 13th century France followed patterns shaped by feudalism and faith. The High Middle Ages saw France divided into numerous territories controlled by kings, dukes, counts, and other nobles who maintained power through complex networks of obligation and loyalty. Most people lived in small villages or towns clustered around castles and churches, their existence structured by agricultural rhythms, religious observances, and the hierarchical relationships that organized medieval society. The routines of daily life reflected both the practical demands of farming and craft production and the cultural patterns established through centuries of Christian tradition and feudal organization. The physical landscape of medieval France encompassed diverse environments from the northern plains to the southern mountains and Mediterranean coast, with most of the population concentrated in regions suitable for agriculture. The countryside showed the effects of centuries of human settlement, with forests cleared for farmland, villages and towns connected by roads and paths, and castles and churches dominating the skyline. The climate varied by region, but generally brought cold winters and warm summers, with rainfall distributed throughout the year supporting agriculture and maintaining the green landscape. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from countless fires, the earthy smell of fields and forests, and the various odors of human and animal habitation. Houses in medieval French towns reflected both social status and available building materials. Wealthy merchant and artisan families lived in substantial structures built from stone or timber frame construction with wattle and daub infill, featuring multiple stories with the ground floor often used for commercial purposes while the family lived above. The typical urban house presented a narrow frontage to the street, with the structure extending back from this facade, creating relatively deep buildings that made efficient use of limited street-facing space. The roofs were covered with tiles or thatch, with regulations in many towns requiring tile to reduce fire danger.
Windows were small and covered with wooden shutters, as glass remained expensive enough that only the wealthy could afford glass windows. The interiors of prosperous French townhouses featured several rooms serving different purposes, with the main hall or common room used for eating and household activities, separate sleeping chambers for family members, and perhaps a solar or private room for the family's use. The furnishings included wooden tables, benches, chairs, beds with fabric hangings for privacy and warmth, chests for storage, and various implements for cooking and household work. The walls might be plastered and painted, while the floors consisted of packed earth, stone, or wooden planks, depending on the room and the family's wealth. Tapestries and woven hangings decorated wealthy homes, providing both visual interest and additional insulation against drafts and cold. The daily routine in French towns began with the ringing of church bells calling the faithful to morning prayers. The sound of bells marked the passage of time throughout the medieval day, with religious houses and parish churches ringing bells at regular intervals for the divine office and other observances. People rose from their beds and began the day's activities, with household members performing various tasks according to their roles and responsibilities. The morning air in different seasons brought varied sensations, from the cold of winter mornings when frost covered surfaces, to the fresh warmth of summer mornings when the sun rose early. The sounds of morning included not only church bells, but also the calls of vendors setting up in markets, the voices of people beginning their work, and the general noise of an urban community awakening.
Breakfast in medieval French households typically consisted of simple food, with bread as the foundation, accompanied by cheese, perhaps some preserved meat, and ale or wine to drink. The bread varied in quality depending on the family's economic status, with white bread made from refined wheat flour being more expensive than darker breads made from rye or mixed grains. The consumption of bread occurred at every meal, with bread serving both as food and as a trencher or edible plate for other foods. The preparation of breakfast involved relatively little cooking, as the main meal of the day would come later, so morning food consisted primarily of items that could be eaten cold or required minimal heating. Commerce and craft production formed the economic foundation of medieval French towns, with specialized workers organized into guilds that regulated entry into trades, maintained quality standards, and controlled competition. The guilds also served social and religious functions, organizing members for mutual support, maintaining chapels dedicated to patron saints, and participating in civic ceremonies and processions. The various crafts included textiles, metalwork, leather goods, pottery, woodwork, and countless other specializations, each with its own techniques, tools, and traditions passed from masters to apprentices through years of training. The production of textiles represented one of the most important industries, with wool being processed into thread through carding and spinning, then woven into cloth on looms that varied from simple home devices to larger equipment in commercial workshops. The sound of spinning wheels and the clack of looms created background noise in districts where textile production occurred, while the dyeing of cloth using various plant and mineral dyes created distinctive smells that characterized certain areas. The finished cloth ranged from coarse material for ordinary use to fine woolens and imported silks for wealthy consumers, with regulations often specifying what types of cloth different social classes could wear.
The marketplace formed the center of commercial activity, with vendors selling food, cloth, pottery, metalwork, and various other goods in stalls or from temporary tables and displays. The market operated on specific days according to charters granted by lords or kings, with regulations controlling when and where trade could occur. The sounds of the market included the calls of vendors advertising their wares, the voices of customers examining goods and negotiating prices, and the general noise of crowds moving through the commercial area. The smells varied depending on the season and goods available, from the aroma of fresh bread and roasted meat to the earthier odors of livestock and the various products of farm and workshop.
Religious observance permeated medieval life, with the Church providing not only spiritual guidance, but also the primary framework for understanding the world and one's place within it. Cathedral and parish churches served as centers of community life, with their architecture designed to inspire awe and direct thoughts toward heaven. The interior of Gothic cathedrals featured soaring arches, large stained glass windows that filled the space with colored light, and decorations celebrating biblical stories and saints' lives. The smell of incense and candle wax filled these spaces, while the sound of chanting and prayers created an acoustic environment quite different from the noise of secular life outside. Women in medieval French society occupied various positions depending on their social class and marital status. Noble women could inherit property and exercise authority over estates in the absence of male relatives, though their legal rights remained limited compared to men. Women from merchant and artisan families often worked alongside their husbands in family businesses, managing shops, keeping accounts, and sometimes continuing the business after widowhood. The majority of women engaged in agricultural work, household management, and textile production, their labor essential to family survival, though often unrecognized in formal legal and economic structures that privileged male activities. Children in medieval French families learned appropriate skills through a combination of formal education and practical experience, with education varying enormously by social class. Sons of nobles and wealthy merchants might be sent to cathedral schools or monasteries, where they learned Latin, theology, and other subjects that prepared them for careers in the church or administration. Most children, however, received little formal education, instead learning their parents' occupations through observation and practice. Apprenticeship represented the primary form of education for children entering crafts, with young people binding themselves to masters for terms of years, during which they learned skills while providing labor. The afternoon hours in French towns saw continued commercial and productive activity, though the pace might slow during the hottest summer days when the sun's intensity made sustained exertion uncomfortable. The narrow streets and tall buildings provided some shade, creating relatively comfortable conditions for movement through the urban environment. The sounds of the afternoon included the continuing noise of markets and workshops, the calls of street vendors offering food and services, and the general bustle of a functioning medieval town. Church bells continued to mark the hours, while the cries of town officials making announcements added to the acoustic landscape.
Feudal obligations structured relationships between lords and vassals, creating complex networks of mutual responsibility that organized political and military power. The lord of a territory maintained authority through his castle, a fortified residence that served both military and administrative functions. The castle dominated the surrounding landscape, its stone walls, towers, and gates providing security while also serving as a visible symbol of lordly power. Inside the castle, the Great Hall served as the center of activities, with the lord holding court, receiving visitors, and dining with his household and guests in this large room furnished with tables, benches, and whatever decorative elements the lord's wealth allowed.
Later in the afternoon, as the day's main work drew toward completion, activities shifted toward preparing for evening. Shops began to close, with merchants packing away goods and securing their premises. Women prepared the main meal of the day, while men finished whatever tasks occupied them. The quality of light changed as the sun descended, becoming warmer and softer, giving the stone buildings and narrow streets a golden glow. The sounds of late afternoon included church bells calling people to vespers, voices calling family members to gather, and the general transition from work to rest. The main meal of the day occurred in the evening, when families gathered to share food and conversation. For most people, this meal consisted of pottage, a thick soup or stew made from whatever ingredients were available, served with bread. The pottage might contain vegetables, legumes, grain, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish, all cooked together in an iron pot hanging over the fire. Wealthier households enjoyed more elaborate meals with multiple courses that might include roasted meat, various vegetable preparations, fine white bread, and wine. The food was served on wooden or pewter plates, with diners using knives and spoons to handle food, as forks had not yet come into common use. Wine drinking accompanied meals in regions where grapes grew well, with France already established as a major wine-producing region. The wine varied enormously in quality, from rough local productions consumed by ordinary people to fine wines from established vineyards that commanded high prices. Water was also consumed, though concerns about water quality meant that ale or wine were often preferred when available and affordable. The consumption of alcoholic beverages occurred within social frameworks that regulated how much and when drinking was appropriate, with drunkenness condemned as sinful and socially disruptive. Evening hours after the meal brought opportunities for leisure and social interaction within the constraints of limited artificial lighting. Candles and oil lamps provided some illumination, though their expense meant they were used sparingly in most households. Wealthier homes might have several candles or lamps burning, creating relatively well-lit spaces, while poorer households made do with the light from the hearth fire. The flickering light created intimate atmospheres where family members might engage in conversation, simple games, or quiet work such as mending clothes or preparing materials for the next day's tasks. Storytelling and music provided entertainment, with professional entertainers, including minstrels and jongleurs, traveling between towns and noble households, performing songs, reciting poetry, and telling stories. These performers combined music, narrative, and sometimes acrobatics or juggling, creating entertainment that appealed to audiences across social classes. The content ranged from religious tales and heroic epics to bawdy songs and satirical pieces that commented on contemporary events and social conditions. The performance of these works created memorable occasions that broke the routine of ordinary life. As darkness fell over French towns, curfew regulations often required people to remain in their homes, with authorities patrolling to maintain order and watch for fires, a constant danger in towns built largely from wood and thatch. The streets became dark and dangerous, with only the occasional glow of a lantern or torch carried by those with legitimate business after dark. Inside homes, families prepared for sleep by banking fires so they would maintain some heat through the night without burning too vigorously, arranging bedding and settling into the sleeping arrangements that varied by household size and wealth. The night brought cooler temperatures and the sounds of a town at rest, with the occasional call of night watchmen, the bark of dogs, and the various small noises of buildings settling and animals moving, creating the nighttime soundscape. The sky on clear nights displayed the stars with exceptional brightness, these celestial lights providing the primary illumination in the absence of street lighting. The church calendar structured time even during sleep, with the ringing of bells for matins in the middle of the night reminding everyone of the constant cycle of prayer that connected earthly life to divine order. Sleep eventually came to most people as the night deepened, their bodies tired from the day's labor. Dreams during these sleeping hours might be interpreted as messages from God or saints, communications that required attention and sometimes consultation with priests or other religious authorities. The cycle of waking and sleeping, like the cycle of seasons and the rhythm of religious observances, represented one of the fundamental patterns that structured existence in medieval France. This simple, steady pattern of daily life in 13th century French towns was an ordinary reality for the people who called these communities their home. Daily life in Florence followed patterns shaped by commerce and cultural ambition. The city reached its cultural and economic height during the 15th and early 16th centuries, becoming one of Europe's most prosperous and creative urban centers. The Medici family and other wealthy merchants controlled political power while patronizing artists, architects, and scholars whose work made Florence legendary throughout the Western world. Most Florentines lived as craftspeople, merchants, or laborers, whose routines reflected both the practical demands of urban life and the distinctive cultural atmosphere created by the convergence of wealth, artistic achievement, and humanist learning that characterized the Renaissance. The physical setting of Florence occupied a valley along the Arno River, surrounded by the rolling hills of Tuscany, covered with vineyards, olive groves, and cypress trees. The city itself presented a distinctive appearance, with buildings constructed from stone and brick, their walls often covered with plaster painted in warm earth tones. The roofs were covered with terracotta tiles that created the characteristic reddish-brown color that dominated the cityscape. Massive public buildings, including the cathedral with Brunelleschi's revolutionary dome, the Palazzo Vecchio with its tall tower, and numerous churches and palaces rose above the ordinary structures, creating a skyline that expressed both civic pride and religious devotion. The air carried the scent of stone dust from constant building projects, the smell of the river, and the various urban odors of a densely populated city. Houses in Florence reflected the social hierarchy that organized urban society, with wealthy merchant families occupying substantial palaces built around central courtyards, while craftspeople and shopkeepers lived in more modest structures, often combining residential and commercial space. The typical palazzo featured a massive stone facade presenting a fortress-like appearance to the street, with the ground floor sometimes featuring an arcade of arches supporting the upper stories. The windows were relatively small on lower floors for security, becoming larger and more decorated on upper levels. The interior courtyard provided light and air to the surrounding rooms while maintaining privacy from the street, with arcaded walkways created covered spaces that connected different parts of the building. The interiors of wealthy Florentine homes combined functionality with increasing attention to aesthetic beauty and comfort. The piano nobile, or main floor, contained the principal rooms, including the sala, or great hall where the family received guests and conducted business, along with private chambers for family members. The furnishings included chairs, tables, chests decorated with carved or painted designs, beds with fabric hangings, and various items that displayed the family's wealth and taste. The walls featured frescoes, paintings, or tapestries depicting religious scenes, classical themes, or family portraits. The ceilings often had exposed wooden beams or coffered designs with painted decoration. The floors might be covered with decorative tiles or wooden planks, while carpets, still relatively rare and expensive, appeared in the wealthiest homes. The daily routine in Florence began with the ringing of church bells calling the faithful to morning prayers, their sound echoing across the city from the numerous churches and religious houses. People rose from their beds and began the day's activities, with household members performing various tasks according to their roles and responsibilities. The morning air varied with the seasons, from the cool freshness of spring and autumn mornings to the already warm air of summer or the cold dampness of winter. The sounds of morning included not only bells, but also the calls of vendors setting up in markets, the voices of craftspeople opening their workshops, and the general noise of an urban community awakening to commerce and production.
Breakfast in Florentine households typically consisted of simple food, with bread as the foundation accompanied by cheese, perhaps some fruit, and wine diluted with water. The bread varied in quality, with white bread made from refined wheat flour being more expensive and prestigious than darker breads. The consumption of wine even in the morning reflected Mediterranean customs, where wine formed a dietary staple consumed throughout the day, though concerns about drunkenness meant that dilution with water was common and expected. The preparation of breakfast required relatively little effort, as the main meal would come later in the day. Banking and commerce formed the economic foundation of Florence, with the city's merchants and bankers controlling financial networks that extended throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The major banking families, including the Medici, maintained operations in multiple cities, handling currency exchange, providing credit, and facilitating trade through letters of credit and other financial instruments that reduced the need to transport large amounts of coin.
The wool and silk industries generated enormous wealth, with Florentine textiles being exported throughout the known world and creating employment for thousands of workers in various stages of production, from raw material processing to finishing and dyeing. The production of wool cloth involved numerous specialized steps, each performed by different workers organized into separate guilds. The raw wool was cleaned, carded to align the fibers, spun into thread, woven into cloth, fulled to increase density and felt the fibers together, stretched on frames to achieve proper dimensions, napped to raise a fuzzy surface, sheared to create a smooth finish, and dyed to achieve desired colors. This complex process created a highly organized industry where different workers contributed specific skills, all coordinated through merchant entrepreneurs who controlled the capital and distribution networks necessary to transform raw wool into finished luxury textiles. Silk production occurred alongside the wool industry, though silk represented an even more prestigious product that commanded higher prices. The cultivation of silkworms and the processing of their cocoons into raw silk required specialized knowledge and careful attention. Florentine silk weavers created elaborate fabrics featuring complex patterns, metallic threads, and brilliant colors achieved through expensive dyes. These luxury textiles served markets throughout Europe, with nobles and wealthy merchants purchasing Florentine silks for clothing and furnishings that displayed their status and wealth. Artistic production represented another characteristic feature of Renaissance Florence, with the city supporting numerous painters, sculptors, architects, and craftspeople whose work responded to demand from both religious institutions and wealthy private patrons. The workshops of major artists employed apprentices and assistants who learned their craft while contributing to the production of paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects. The training of artists combined practical skill development with increasing attention to theoretical knowledge, including geometry, perspective, anatomy, and classical learning that informed Renaissance artistic practice.
Humanist scholarship flourished in Florence, with wealthy patrons supporting scholars who studied classical Latin and Greek texts, translating and commenting on ancient works while also producing new literature in both Latin and the vernacular Italian language. The rediscovery and study of classical learning represented a central feature of the Renaissance, with humanists arguing that ancient wisdom could guide contemporary life and that the study of classical texts developed virtues including eloquence, wisdom, and civic responsibility. These scholars gathered in academies and informal discussion groups, debating philosophical questions and literary matters, while also serving as secretaries and advisors to governments and wealthy families. Women in Renaissance Florence occupied complex positions determined by their social class and family circumstances. Elite women received education in reading and sometimes classical languages, though their intellectual activities were generally constrained by expectations about proper female behavior. Women could not hold public office or pursue most professions, though they managed households, controlled property through dowries and inheritances, and sometimes patronized artists and scholars. Women from artisan families often worked alongside their husbands in family businesses, while the majority of women engaged in domestic service, textile production, and the various forms of labor necessary for urban life. Children in Florentine families received varying levels of education depending on their social class and gender.
Boys from elite families studied Latin, classical literature, mathematics, and other subjects with private tutors or in schools, preparing for careers in commerce, government, or the church. Girls from wealthy families learned reading, often in the vernacular rather than Latin, along with music, dance, and the accomplishments expected of women of their class. Most children received little formal education, instead learning their parents' occupations through observation and practice, or entering apprenticeships where they would spend years learning crafts while providing labor to masters. The afternoon hours in Florence saw continued commercial and productive activity, with the streets filled with people conducting business, craftspeople at work in their shops, and the general bustle of a prosperous city. The narrow streets created shade that made summer afternoons tolerable, while the stone buildings maintained relatively cool interiors. The sounds included the ongoing noise of markets and workshops, the calls of vendors, and conversations in the distinctive Florentine dialect of Italian. Church bells continued to mark the hours, structuring time and reminding everyone of religious obligations that remained important despite the increasing secularization of Renaissance culture. Political life in Florence operated through a complex republican system where power was supposedly shared among citizens, though in practice wealthy families dominated government through various mechanisms, including the control of election procedures and the strategic use of marriage alliances and financial relationships. The government met in the Palazzo Vecchio, where officials conducted civic business and made decisions about war, diplomacy, taxation, and the countless other matters requiring governmental attention. Public ceremonies and processions regularly occurred, displaying civic unity and the authority of the Republic, while also providing entertainment and reinforcing social hierarchies through the order of precedence in these events.
Later in the afternoon, as the day's main work drew toward completion, activities shifted toward preparing for evening. Shops began to close, with merchants securing their premises and craftspeople finishing their day's production. Women prepared the main meal of the day, while men concluded whatever business occupied them. The quality of light changed as the sun descended toward the western hills, becoming warmer and giving the stone and brick buildings a golden glow that highlighted their architectural features. The sounds of late afternoon included church bells calling people to vespers, voices calling family members home, and the general transition from work to leisure. The main meal of the day occurred in the evening, when families gathered to share food and conversation. For ordinary Florentines, this meal consisted of bread, soup or pasta, vegetables, and perhaps some fish or meat when available and affordable. Wealthier households enjoyed elaborate meals with multiple courses that might include various meat preparations, pasta dishes, vegetables cooked in different ways, desserts made from almonds and honey, and wine from the family's estates or purchased from reputable producers. The food reflected both Italian culinary traditions and increasing attention to presentation and variety that characterized Renaissance dining practices. The meal was consumed while seated at tables using the recently introduced fork along with traditional knives and spoons. Wine drinking accompanied meals and represented an important element of Florentine social life, with the region's wines already enjoying high reputations. The wine was typically consumed diluted with water, though the proportions varied by circumstance and personal preference.
The serving and consumption of wine followed certain customs and etiquette, with proper behavior at table being considered a mark of refinement and civilization. Treatises on manners instructed readers on how to conduct themselves at meals, reflecting Renaissance concern with cultivating proper behavior and elegant living. Evening hours after the meal brought opportunities for various forms of leisure and social interaction, with activities varying by social class and personal circumstances. Wealthy households might host gatherings where guests engaged in conversation, listened to music, or discussed literature and philosophy, following patterns established by humanist ideals about civilized society. Professional musicians performed for elite audiences, playing instruments including the lute, viol, and various early keyboard instruments, while singers performed both secular and religious music. The sound of music drifted from palaces and homes during evening hours, creating an acoustic landscape that reflected Renaissance cultural achievements. Reading had become more common than in earlier periods, with the increasing availability of books through both manuscript production and, after mid-century, printing with movable type. Wealthy households owned libraries containing classical texts, religious works, contemporary literature, and various other books that served both practical and scholarly purposes. Reading occurred by candlelight or lamplight, with beeswax candles being preferred for their cleaner burning and less offensive odor compared to tallow candles used by those with fewer resources. The flickering light created intimate spaces where readers could pursue knowledge or entertainment through the written word.
Gambling and games provided entertainment across social classes, with card games, dice, and various board games being popular despite periodic attempts by authorities to regulate or prohibit gambling. These games occurred in taverns, homes, and public spaces, with the potential for both social interaction and the loss of money, creating a mix of pleasure and danger that made gambling attractive to many despite its risks. The games themselves varied from simple chance-based activities to more complex strategic games that required skill and calculation. As darkness fell over Florence, the city became quieter, though not entirely silent, as curfew regulations were less strictly enforced than in some medieval cities, and people continued various activities into the night. The streets remained dangerous after dark, with only occasional torches or lanterns providing illumination. But the city maintained night watches who patrolled to prevent crime and watch for fires. Inside homes, families prepared for sleep by securing doors and windows, banking fires, and arranging bedding. The night sounds included the calls of watchmen, the occasional voice or footstep in the street, and the various small noises of buildings and their inhabitants. The night sky over Florence displayed the stars with clarity, though the city's lights reduced their visibility compared to rural areas. Renaissance scholars studied astronomy as part of their investigation of the natural world, making observations and calculations that contributed to the gradually developing understanding of celestial mechanics. The study of the stars served both practical purposes, such as timekeeping and navigation, and intellectual goals related to understanding the structure of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. Sleep eventually came to most Florentines as the night deepened, their bodies tired from the day's activities. Dreams during these sleeping hours might be interpreted according to various schemes of dream analysis that circulated in both learned and popular contexts. The cycle of waking and sleeping, like the cycle of work and rest, represented one of the fundamental rhythms that structured existence in Renaissance Florence.
This simple, steady pattern of daily life in one of history's most culturally productive cities was an ordinary reality for the people who called Florence their home.